Hello, I never thought I'd be posting here, but life has a way of throwing curveballs that leave you questioning everything. My name is Mike, and I've been married to Lisa for 8 years. We met back in college, and it was one of those whirlwind romances. Everything felt perfect. We clicked in every way, or at least I thought we did. We bought a house together, traveled, and even talked about starting a family soon. But over the last few months, things have been off. At first, it was subtle. She'd stay late at work more often, seemed distracted even when we were spending time together, and started caring a lot more about how she looked before going out, even just to run errands. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was overthinking it, maybe projecting my own insecurities onto her. But something kept nagging at me, a voice in the back of my head telling me that something was seriously wrong. Now, I'm not a naturally paranoid person. I've always trusted Lisa completely. But this wasn't just paranoia. This was a gut feeling, something I couldn't ignore any longer. I wish I had, though, because what I discovered turned my world upside down. Little did I know this was just the beginning of a nightmare I never saw coming. All right, so here's how it all unraveled. One evening, Lisa mentioned she had to work late again. It was a Friday, and we'd always spend our Friday nights together, so it struck me as odd, but I didn't say anything, just nodded and pretended everything was fine. The thing is, I had already noticed a pattern. She'd been working late on Fridays for the past few weeks, always with the same vague excuses. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I decided to do something I never thought I would. I went through her phone. She had been careful deleting most of her texts, but she wasn't as thorough with her emails. There it was, an email from a guy named Jason, someone I'd never heard of. It was short, just a confirmation about meeting up at his place that night, with a wink emoji at the end. My heart dropped. I wanted to convince myself it was innocent, maybe a work thing, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. I decided to follow her that night. I knew I had to be sure before confronting her, as accusing your wife of cheating without solid proof could lead to a lot of unnecessary pain and drama. So when she left the house, I waited a few minutes and then followed her. I stayed far enough behind so she wouldn't notice, but close enough to keep track of where she was going. She drove to the other side of town, to a quiet neighborhood I'd never been to. I watched from a distance as she parked in front of a house and casually walked up to the door, smiling in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. My stomach churned when the door opened, and Jason, the guy from the email, greeted her with a hug that lasted a little too long. He pulled her inside, and that was it. I knew. There was no denying it anymore. I drove home in a daze, barely aware of the road in front of me. It felt like the world was crumbling around me, and I was powerless to stop it. I wanted to scream, to confront her right then and there, but instead, I just sat in our empty house, the silence echoing around me, wondering how the hell my life had come to this. The next morning, I was a mess. I hadn't slept at all. My mind was racing with a million questions, each one more painful than the last. How long had this been going on? Why did she do it? Was it my fault? I knew I couldn't keep this to myself any longer. I needed answers, even if they were going to rip me apart. When Lisa came home, it was like nothing had happened. She greeted me with a smile, kissed me on the cheek, and started making coffee as if she hadn't just spent the night in another man's arms. The audacity of it all made my blood boil. I couldn't keep it in any longer. "Who's Jason?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Her hand froze on the coffee pot, and for a split second I saw the panic flash in her eyes. But then, just as quickly, she composed herself and turned to me with a puzzled expression. "Jason? I don't know any Jason," she said, feigning confusion. "Why do you ask?" I felt a surge of anger. "Don't lie to me, Lisa. I know you were with him last night. I followed you and I saw everything. So don't even try to play dumb." Her expression shifted from confusion to anger, a defensive look crossing her face. "I can't believe you followed me. Are you seriously spying on me now? This is insane, Mike. You're being paranoid." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She wasn't even trying to deny it. Instead, she was turning it around on me, making me out to be the bad guy. It was like being punched in the gut. I had expected tears, apologies, some sign of remorse, but all I got was anger and deflection. "You're cheating on me," I said, my voice breaking. "How long has this been going on? Do you even care about us anymore?" She rolled her eyes and sighed as if I was asking her to do something trivial. "You're overreacting. It's not what you think. Jason is just a friend, okay? We were just hanging out, nothing happened. You need to chill out and stop acting like a jealous freak. The sheer nerve of her left me speechless. I couldn't believe she was lying so blatantly, even when caught red-handed. It was like she didn't even care that she was tearing our marriage apart. Or worse, that she was enjoying watching me suffer. I tried to stay calm, but I felt like I was going to explode. You expect me to believe that? After everything I've seen? Stop lying, Lisa. Just tell me the truth. She crossed her arms and leaned against the counter, her eyes cold and distant. You want the truth? Fine. Yes, I've been seeing Jason for a few months now. But you know what, Mike? I don't regret it. Maybe if you weren't so boring and predictable, I wouldn't have had to look elsewhere for some excitement. Her words hit me like a sledgehammer. The Lisa I knew, the woman I loved, was gone. In her place was a cold, heartless person who didn't give a damn about the pain she was causing. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't just about cheating. She didn't respect me anymore, and maybe she never really did. After she spat out those words, it felt like everything inside me shattered. I just stood there, stunned, unable to process the cruelty of what she'd said. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, each beat more painful than the last. I'd always thought that if something like this ever happened, I'd be strong enough to handle it. But nothing could have prepared me for the sheer agony that came with hearing the person you love tell you they don't care anymore. I couldn't even look at her. I turned away, staring blankly at the wall, trying to hold back the tears that were threatening to fall. How had we gotten here? 8 years of marriage gone just like that. I thought back to all the moments we'd shared, the laughter, the plans we made, the promises we'd kept, or at least the promises I thought we'd kept. It felt like my entire life had been a lie. Lisa didn't say anything after her outburst. She just stood there, arms crossed, her expression indifferent, like she was waiting for me to say something, or maybe just waiting for me to leave. The silence between us was deafening, filled with all the things I wanted to scream but couldn't find the words for. Finally, I managed to speak, though my voice was barely above a whisper. So that's it then? You're just going to throw everything away because you're bored? Because you needed some excitement? She shrugged, her eyes narrowing slightly. Mike, I'm not throwing anything away. I'm just being honest with you. Our marriage has been dead for a long time and you know it. You're just too afraid to admit it. I'm sorry if that hurts you, but it's the truth. And I'm not going to apologize for wanting something more out of life. Her words cut deeper than any knife ever could. It was as if she was stabbing me repeatedly, with every sentence more brutal than the last. I'd always known things weren't perfect between us, but I never imagined she felt this way, that she could be so cold, so indifferent to the pain she was causing. How could someone I'd spent nearly a decade with turn into a complete stranger before my eyes? I felt like I was drowning, gasping for air in a sea of betrayal, anger, and heartbreak. I couldn't stay in that room with her any longer. I needed to get out, to breathe, to clear my head. I turned to leave, grabbing my keys off the counter, and she didn't even try to stop me. She just watched as I walked out the door, her face emotionless, as if she couldn't care less whether I stayed or left. I got in my car and drove aimlessly, not knowing where to go or what to do. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions, rage, despair, confusion. I found myself parked in a deserted lot, staring out at nothing, feeling utterly lost. I'd given this woman everything, and in return, she'd torn my heart to pieces without a second thought. That night, I slept on the couch, unable to bear the thought of lying next to her. I couldn't close my eyes without seeing her with Jason, without hearing her cold, callous words echoing in my mind. The pain was unbearable, and the worst part was, I didn't know if it would ever go away. The next few days were a blur. I avoided Lisa as much as possible, barely speaking to her except when absolutely necessary. It was like we were two strangers living under the same roof, each pretending the other didn't exist. I couldn't stand to look at her, knowing what she'd done and how little she cared, but I also knew I couldn't live like this forever. I had to make a decision about what to do next. Divorce seemed like the only option, but the thought of it made me sick. This was the woman I'd planned to spend the rest of my life with. We had a house, shared memories, and dreams that were now nothing but ashes. The idea of tearing all that apart felt like admitting defeat, like letting her win. But staying together wasn't an option either, not after everything that had happened. My mind kept going back to that night when I followed her to Jason's place. I couldn't get the image of them together out of my head. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I wasn't just angry, I wanted revenge. I wanted her to feel the same pain she'd inflicted on me, to see her world crumble the way mine had. But I knew I couldn't do this alone. I reached out to my two closest friends, Chris and Eric, who had always been there for me through thick and thin. They were shocked and furious when I told them what had happened. I could hear the anger in their voices, the same anger that was boiling inside me. We met up that night, had a few drinks, and started talking about what to do next. At first, it was just talk-venting our frustrations, throwing around ideas for how to make Lisa and Jason pay for what they'd done. But as the night went on and the drinks kept flowing, the conversation took a darker turn. Chris, who had always been the more impulsive one, suggested we do something drastic, something they'd never forget. We should confront them, but not just with words, Chris said, his eyes gleaming with a dangerous light. We need to hit them where it hurts, make them regret ever messing with us. Eric, who was usually the voice of reason, nodded in agreement. Yeah, man, they deserve to suffer for what they did to you. Let's do something that'll shake them to their core, something they won't see coming. As I listened to them, a plan began to form in my mind, a plan that was equal parts desperation and anger. I knew where Jason lived, and I knew that Lisa had a habit of meeting him there. We could wait for them to get comfortable, thinking they'd gotten away with everything, and then we'd strike. We'll go to his house, I said, my voice cold and determined. We'll wait until they're alone, and then we'll make our move. They won't see it coming. Chris and Eric were on board immediately, their own anger fueling their eagerness to help. We agreed to meet the next night, all of us ready to put the plan into action. It wasn't just about revenge anymore, it was about reclaiming some sense of control over a situation that had spun out of my grasp. The next day dragged on as I went through the motions at work, my mind consumed with thoughts of what we were about to do. I kept telling myself that they deserved it, that this was the only way to make things right. But deep down, a part of me wondered if I was about to make the biggest mistake of my life. Still, I couldn't turn back now. That night, my two friends and I drove to the house where our cheating wives were having dates with their lovers. We waited until they went to their rooms, then I damaged the electrical wiring and the house went dark. My friend took out 6 combat grenades and said, "It's time to start the real brutal revenge." But this was just the beginning of their nightmare. The house stood silent and dark, its once inviting facade now cloaked in shadows. The only light came from the faint glow of street lamps, casting eerie patterns across the yard. Inside, Lisa and her accomplice were oblivious to the chaos about to unfold. My heart pounded in my chest as I looked at Chris and Eric, their faces set with grim determination. "Are we really doing this?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Chris grinned, a sinister look in his eyes. They asked for it. Time to give them what they deserve. Eric nodded, pulling out a pair of night vision goggles. Let's move. We approached the house quietly, each step measured and deliberate. The damaged electrical wiring ensured that the security system was down, giving us the window we needed. Chris handed me a grenade, its cold metal sending a shiver down my spine. I had never held one before, let alone thought I'd use it against someone I once loved. We entered through the back door, which was conveniently unlocked. Jason's oversight would be his downfall. The interior was pitch black, but with the night vision goggles, we navigated the hallways effortlessly. Muffled sounds emanated from the master bedroom, laughter mixed with intimate whispers. The realization of what was happening behind that door fueled my resolve. Chris signaled for us to take positions. We each stood outside different entry points to the bedroom, grenades in hand. On Chris' count, we burst into the room, pulling the pins and tossing the grenades strategically to avoid fatal harm, but to maximize shock and awe. The room erupted in chaos. Deafening bangs echoed as smoke filled the air, the pungent smell of sulfur assaulting our senses. Lisa and Jason screamed, scrambling to make sense of the situation. Their faces were masks of terror, eyes wide and bodies trembling. "What the hell is going on?" Jason yelled, coughing as he tried to locate his clothes. Lisa clutched the sheets to her chest, her expression a mix of fear and indignation. Mike! What are you doing here? Are you insane? I stepped forward, my voice cold and devoid of emotion. Consider this payback for every lie, every betrayal. You thought you could walk all over me, disrespect our marriage, and face no consequences? Think again. Chris and Eric stood beside me, their imposing figures adding to the intimidation. Jason looked like he was about to wet himself, while Lisa's usual arrogance faltered for the first time. "You can't do this!" she screeched, her voice cracking. "This is illegal! I'll call the cops!" Eric chuckled, a dark sound that sent shivers down my spine. "Go ahead. Explain to them why your husband had to resort to such measures. I'm sure they'd love to hear about your extracurricular activities." Jason stumbled towards a drawer, presumably searching for a weapon. Chris was quicker, lunging forward and pinning him against the wall. "Don't even think about it!" he growled. Lisa started sobbing, tears streaming down her face, but I felt nothing, no pity, no remorse. This was the woman who had shattered my heart without a second thought, who had belittled and disrespected me. Her tears were nothing more than crocodile tears, a last-ditch effort to manipulate the situation. I leaned in closer, locking eyes with her. "This is just the beginning. You wanted excitement? Well, here it is. Enjoy the nightmare you've created." With that, we retreated, leaving them in a cloud of smoke and fear. As we exited the house, the distant wail of sirens began to fill the night air. Time was short, but the message had been sent. Betrayal comes with a price, and they were just starting to pay. As we drove away from the house, my heart raced, but a strange sense of calm settled over me. The tension that had been gnawing at me for days began to ebb, replaced by a cold clarity. What we'd done was reckless, but I didn't regret it. Lisa and Jason needed to understand that actions have consequences, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I was back in control of my life. We made it back to my place without incident, the adrenaline still coursing through our veins. Chris and Eric were quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts about what had just transpired. When we finally parked, Chris broke the silence. "Well, that was intense," he said, lighting a cigarette with shaky hands. "I can't believe we actually did it." Eric leaned back in his seat, exhaling slowly. "They won't forget this night anytime soon. They thought they could get away with destroying your life, Mike. But we showed them what happens when you mess with the wrong people." I nodded, still processing everything. But as the adrenaline started to wear off, the reality of what we'd done began to sink in. The sound of those sirens wasn't just in my imagination. They were real, and the authorities would be involved soon. I had to prepare myself for what was coming next. The next morning, I was woken up by a loud knock at the door. My heart sank as I opened it to find two police officers standing on my porch. They didn't look pleased. "Michael Thompson?" one of them asked, his voice stern. "Yeah, that's me," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "We need to ask you a few questions about an incident that occurred last night," the officer continued. "We've received a report of an unlawful entry, vandalism, and an alleged assault. You're going to need to come with us to the station." My stomach churned, but I kept my composure. "Can I make a phone call first?" The officer nodded, and I quickly called my lawyer, explaining the situation as calmly as I could. He agreed to meet me at the station and advised me to say as little as possible until he arrived. I could already see how this was going to play out. Lisa and Jason would paint themselves as the victims, and I'd be the unhinged husband who lost control. At the station, I was questioned for hours. Lisa had already filed a restraining order against me, claiming that I'd threatened her life and damaged her property. Jason backed up her story, conveniently leaving out the part about their affair and the reason why I'd snapped in the first place. I didn't deny being at the house, but I kept my answers vague, letting my lawyer handle most of the talking. Eventually, I was released, but the damage had been done. Word spread quickly, and soon everyone in our social circle knew about the incident. Some people were sympathetic, understanding how betrayal could push someone to the edge. Others judged me harshly, calling me unstable and dangerous. Lisa didn't waste any time playing the victim. She moved out of our house and into Jason's place, plastering social media with posts about how she was finally free from a toxic relationship. Her friends rallied around her, offering their support, while I became the villain of the story. It was infuriating to watch, knowing the truth of what had really happened, but powerless to stop the narrative she was spinning. Despite the legal troubles, I couldn't bring myself to regret what I'd done. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming my dignity, my self-respect. Lisa had taken so much from me, but I refused to let her take everything. I knew there would be consequences, but in a twisted way, I welcomed them. At least it meant I was still fighting, still standing up for myself. But the reality of the situation was starting to hit home. My marriage was over, my reputation was in tatters, and I was facing possible charges that could have serious repercussions. The nightmare wasn't over yet, it was just beginning to take a new, darker form. And as much as I tried to hold on to the cold satisfaction of revenge, a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that I'd lost something far more important in the process. The days following my release were a blur of legal meetings, sleepless nights, and endless second-guessing. My lawyer assured me that we had a good chance of getting the charges reduced or even dropped, but nothing was certain. The weight of everything was crushing, and every moment felt like I was teetering on the edge of a cliff. Lisa's restraining order meant I couldn't go back to our house. She had taken over the place, filling it with her and Jason's things as if our life together had never existed. I stayed with Chris for a while, but eventually, I moved into a small apartment across town. It was a far cry from the home I had once shared with my wife, but it was quiet, and I needed that. It gave me space to think, to process everything that had happened. The reality of my situation hit me hardest in those quiet moments, alone in that unfamiliar space. I had lost almost everything, my wife, my home, my peace of mind. Lisa's betrayal had taken so much from me, but my actions that night had cost me even more. I had acted out of rage and pain, and while it had felt satisfying in the moment, the long-term consequences were starting to sink in. I knew I wasn't innocent in all this. I had let my anger get the better of me, and now I was paying the price. But what haunted me most was the realization that despite everything, a part of me still cared about Lisa. I hated her for what she had done, but I couldn't shake the memories of the good times we'd shared. It was like grieving for someone who was still alive, someone who had chosen to walk away and leave you behind. Chris and Eric checked in on me regularly, but even their company couldn't fill the void. I was stuck in a limbo of sorts, unable to move forward, yet unwilling to go back. I spent hours replaying the events in my head, wondering if I had made the right choices, if there was anything I could have done differently. I started seeing a therapist, something I never thought I'd do. At first, I was resistant, not wanting to open up to a stranger about my failures. But as the sessions went on, I began to see the value in it. The therapist helped me unpack the layers of anger and betrayal, the grief that came with losing someone you thought you knew. She helped me see that what Lisa had done wasn't my fault, but that I was responsible for how I responded to it. One day, during a particularly difficult session, my therapist asked me a question that cut through everything. "What do you want to do now, Mike? Do you want to keep holding on to this anger, or do you want to find a way to let go and start rebuilding your life?" The question stuck with me long after I left her office. What did I want? Revenge had been my first instinct, but now that it was done, I realized it hadn't brought me the closure I was hoping for. It hadn't healed the wound, it had just masked the pain temporarily. The bitterness was still there, eating away at me, and I knew I couldn't live like this forever. I started thinking about what it would mean to move on, to let go of the anger and start focusing on myself again. It wouldn't be easy. The damage Lisa had done couldn't be undone, and the mess I'd made in response had its own lasting consequences. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that clinging to the past was only going to keep me trapped in this cycle of pain and regret. So I made a decision. I'd cooperate fully with my lawyer to resolve the legal issues as best as possible, and then I'd walk away from this chapter of my life for good. I'd let the house go, let Lisa and Jason have whatever they wanted, and focus on rebuilding from scratch. It wouldn't be easy, but it was the only way forward that made sense. I had to find a way to live for myself again, to rediscover who I was without Lisa and without the anger that had consumed me. Letting go of the past was going to be the hardest thing I'd ever done, but for the first time in a long while, I felt like I could see a glimmer of hope on the horizon. Maybe, just maybe, there was a future waiting for me, one where I could find peace and start over. As the weeks passed, I slowly began to piece my life back together. The legal case dragged on, but with the help of my lawyer, I managed to get the charges reduced to a misdemeanor for property damage. I was slapped with a hefty fine, community service, and mandatory anger management classes. It wasn't the outcome I had hoped for, but it was far better than the alternative. The anger management classes were surprisingly helpful. I had always considered myself a level-headed guy, but the events of the past few months had shown me a side of myself that I didn't recognize. The classes forced me to confront my anger in a constructive way, to understand its roots, and to learn how to control it. It was humbling but also empowering. I started to see that while Lisa's betrayal had triggered my rage, the way I handled it was entirely up to me. During this time, I also began distancing myself from Chris and Eric. They had been good friends, but I realized that our plan for revenge had taken things too far. It wasn't healthy, and I needed to surround myself with people who would help me move forward, not pull me back into the darkness. It was a tough decision, but one I knew I had to make. Lisa, meanwhile, continued to play the victim, but as time went on, fewer people believed her narrative. The truth had a way of leaking out, and those who knew us both started to see through her lies. I didn't care much about what people thought of me anymore. I was done trying to control the story. I just wanted to focus on rebuilding my life. One day, out of the blue, Lisa reached out to me. She called, asking if we could meet to talk. I was hesitant at first, unsure of what she could possibly want. But curiosity got the better of me, and I agreed. We met at a neutral spot, a coffee shop downtown. She looked different, tired and worn out, as if the weight of everything had finally caught up with her. I expected anger or more lies, but what I got instead was something unexpected, an apology. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened," she began, her voice shaky. "And I realize now how much I hurt you. I was selfish, and I let my own issues destroy what we had. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed to say I'm sorry." Her words hit me hard. Part of me wanted to lash out, to tell her that sorry wasn't enough, that she had ruined everything. But another part of me, the part that had been working so hard to move on, felt a strange sense of relief. Maybe it was because I had been waiting for this moment, for some acknowledgement of the pain she caused. I took a deep breath, choosing my words carefully. "I appreciate the apology, Lisa, but I've come to realize that I can't keep holding on to all this anger. It's been eating me alive, and I need to let it go. I don't know if I can ever forgive you, but I'm ready to move on with my life." She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I understand. I'm truly sorry for everything. I hope you find happiness, Mike. You deserve it." We parted ways after that, and I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The apology didn't erase what had happened, but it gave me a sense of closure that I hadn't realized I needed. I finally felt like I could put this chapter behind me. In the months that followed, I focused on rebuilding. I threw myself into work, started picking up old hobbies again, and even reconnected with some friends I had lost touch with over the years. I made new friends, two people who didn't know me as Lisa's husband or the guy who snapped, but just as Mike. It was refreshing, a chance to redefine myself on my own terms. I also started dating again, cautiously at first. It wasn't easy to trust after what had happened, but I knew I couldn't let Lisa's betrayal define my future. I met a woman named Sarah, who was kind, patient, and understanding. She knew about my past, but didn't judge me for it. With her, I found something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Looking back, I realized that Lisa's betrayal, as painful as it was, had forced me to confront parts of myself I had been ignoring for years. It pushed me to grow, to face my anger, and to take responsibility for my own happiness. I learned that revenge doesn't heal wounds, it just deepens them. Real healing comes from within, from finding the strength to let go and move forward. If there's one piece of advice I could give to anyone going through something similar, it's this: don't let someone else's actions dictate your life. You're stronger than you think, and you have the power to rebuild no matter how broken you feel. Life is too short to be consumed by anger and bitterness. Let go, move on, and find your peace. Bye-bye.